Hello everybody, welcome back to High Ground. My name is Tanner, and today we're going to be talking about the roster changes for Europe coming into stage number 2 for Rainbow Six Siege 2024. So I was actually going to do a different video. Maybe I'll still end up doing that, we'll see. But enough people requested this, so we're talking about the European roster changes. I wasn't originally planning on talking about them. I thought the North American changes were just by far the most exciting. But if you go back before Esports World Cup and you factor in all the changes since Stage 1, which is what we're doing, I do think there's a lot of exciting ones. But we just had seen a lot of the changes already in effect that it wasn't so fresh in my mind. But if you didn't watch Esports World Cup, if you only watched the official Ubisoft competitions, then a lot of these changes could blow your mind, could be very exciting to you. We're going to ramp up a little bit. We're going to start with the teams that didn't make any changes, so stay buckled in. I swear there's some exciting ones, but there are actually 3 teams from Europe, 1/3 of the teams that didn't make any changes, compared to North America. We saw only 1 team not make any changes. But okay, let's kick it off with BDS, the pretty clearly, I think, the best team in the world. They just won Esports World Cup very dominantly. Before that, they made it all the way to the grand final, made it to map 5, but ended up losing against Beast Coast. So Shaiko, Bride, Likafak, Uzus, and Solotov all stick around. I thought when they formed this team, and I think a lot of people had this opinion, that it looked like the strongest team in the world on paper. And I think some people had some arguments, you know, like the Furia roster, because of all their achievements, you had to put them higher up pound for pound. But I think after seeing this team play and win, you know, do as well as they have done, making a grand final and then winning a grand final, and especially with how dominant they were in EWC, like I just feel like this is the best team as a team, and also pound for pound, it's really hard to compete with these guys. Let's see if they go on a big run or something, or if they can get stopped in their tracks by somebody. It does look pretty clearly like Likafak is the best player in the world at the moment, and I think Uzus has a case for number 2. Enough about these guys, let's move on to Into the Breach, and now we have a bit of a fall off. I'm not putting these teams in order. I did put the better teams at the beginning though, and that's just how it works out. If a team's really good, they're less likely to make roster changes, and I did put the teams with fewer changes at the beginning for the most part. Azure, Kendrew, Noah, Creeds, and Oscar was the team and is the team going forward. No changes, and I think this team has a case potentially for being the second best team in Europe. They qualified for Manchester. They didn't do very well at Manchester, admittedly, but neither did G2, one of the other European teams. They were certainly outdone by BDS and Secret. But then Secret didn't qualify for Esports World Cup, whereas Into the Breach did, and they also didn't do spectacularly well there. So I think that hurts their claim a little bit, but the competition for second place in Europe, I don't think is nearly as fierce as it is in the likes of Brazil and North America. Like clearly BDS are number 1, and then Into the Breach and a few other teams we'll talk about in a minute, I think are, you know, sort of interchangeable in the second tier. So I think these guys will probably continue to be good, but we'll see if this roster is good enough to be a real international competitor or not. If they qualify for the next event but don't do so well, I think probably some roster changes are in order. We'll have to see. Then we have Virtus Pro, another team that, yeah, making no roster changes. And so we'll actually be talking about some roster changes in a minute, but again, let's get all these out of the way at the beginning. Joystick, Shepard, Dan, Always, and Pasha. These guys have been a 5-stack for quite some time now. Joystick and Shepard have been playing together for an eternity, and Dan and Always not quite as long, but still they've been here for a really long time. Pasha, the newest member, has also been on this team for a solid amount of time now, and they were pretty good last year. They made top 11 at both majors and then top 3 at SI, but they failed to qualify for Manchester. They failed to qualify for Esports World Cup. Although I will say they had to play against BDS in an elimination game, the team that went on to win Esports World Cup, so that feels pretty bad. I think they probably would have qualified had they had a different path in the qualifiers, but maybe not. You know, the other teams that made it were Into the Breach and Wolves, neither of which did especially well at the event, so I do believe they would have made it, but that is speculative. Let's see how they do going forward. Maybe this team finally will be washed, but it does seem like no matter the era of this game, Joystick, Shepard, and the boys always have a shot at making a very deep run at events, maybe even making a grand final. Okay, finally, we're on to the actual roster changes. So Secret I started out with because, yeah, I wanted to talk about all the good teams first. So I talked about the second tier within Europe, and I do feel like it is currently Virtus Pro, Secret, and Into the Breach. And then, yeah, we'll see the other teams in a minute. Maybe you think those other teams have potential to to make major over one of these three teams, two of these, however many of these three teams that we have just talked about. But I do think they really need to prove themselves. So, G2, Wolves, Fnatic, etc. They made some roster changes, but even before the roster changes, they weren't doing spectacularly. So they're, again, going to have to prove themselves. So back to Secret. Savage, Groovy, Miracle, Joom, and Adrian was their roster. They dropped Miracle for Virtue. This seems like a decent change. It sounds like there was some visa concerns with Miracle that may have been the majority of the reason he was dropped, or just a part of the reason, or maybe it was just an excuse. I don't know for certain. Virtue seems like a good pickup. Obviously a really tenured player. He was on G2 for a really long time. He is not a reigning world champion, but he won last year with G2. So a lot of accolades. He's proven to be very consistent. Is he past his prime? I mean, almost certainly. Like, nobody plays for this for the amount of time that he has and still hasn't reached their prime. Like, that just never happens. But he could certainly still be a big role player. I don't think this team is necessarily hurting for experience, but he is now by far the most experienced player on this roster. And then Groovy, it sounded like he was maybe not necessarily retiring, but he was taking a step away from the game and or competitive play. But although it doesn't officially say it on Liquipedia, it sounds like he's coming back to the playing roster. It does still show his slot as TBD on Liquipedia, but that's what I've heard, is that he will just be coming back to play. So Savage, Joom, Adrian, Virtue, and Groovy should be the roster for Secret going forward. One of the stronger teams, I think, in Europe, not quite on the level of BDS, but as far as ceiling, based on what we've seen, especially in Manchester, it seems like they have a pretty good claim at the second spot. Okay, now we're moving into simply put, the less good teams, and I put this one early. Technically, this is the most quote-unquote exciting because it has the most changes, but how many of these names do you actually know? I put changes all because they've dropped all these players and picked up all new players. Technically, you do see Packbull here twice. He left the roster, played for another team in the meantime, and now he's back to Wild. And Wild as a team really just has gone downhill since the whole Aces incident. Anyways, they were Teb, Packbull, Kanto, Lalo, and Nello, and now Nello, not in the playing roster, but he's their coach, but new playing roster basically. Packbull, Dodo, Freak, Leighton, and Croxon. Dodo was actually on the team as like a sub or whatever, and he did sub in for at least one of their LCQ games. I think just by default, this is the worst team in Europe until proven otherwise, but maybe fortunately for them, depending on how you look at it, Europe is a little bit less competitive at the bottom than the likes of North America and Brazil, once again, the other two big regions. Okay, moving on from Wild, we have ENCE, and they had some weird six-man roster thing going on, and they remedied that. They dropped Frenchie and Jax. They picked up Alem, so they do have a pretty clear five-man roster. And these guys were very, very new in Stage 1. All six, I guess, of these players were making their T1 debut. They had been rolling around in T2 for some time, so they had experience as a unit, which I do think helped them in some regards, but wasn't good enough to make Manchester, wasn't good enough to make EWC. And they do bring on an extremely experienced player in Alems. He played on BDS for a very long time, but he had experience playing on other rosters even before then. He's been around basically since the very beginning of this game. So yeah, you couldn't really pick up a more experienced French-speaking player than Alems. I guess Rinshiro's also been around for a very, very long time, but I think Alems being more of a leadership figure is probably what they need. They did show the potential to make some upsets, to put up some good games in stage number 1. They were, I think, the only team to beat BDS in round robin. So yeah, I mean, they've shown promise. They now have more experience under their belts, both as these four players as well as a whole, because of the pickup of Alem. They're one to keep your eye on, I think. A little bit of underdogs because, again, how new most of their players are, but I think they are one that could continue to make upsets, maybe even more than they did before. And then we have Wolves. A lot of people were questioning these roster changes, and then they qualified for EWC, which was really nice, but then they got destroyed at EWC, particularly Asa. And I get that he does play support roles, like his main operator was Thermite, but he went 7-27. I think those stats are pretty inexcusable for any player on any roles. Obviously, you're going to do worse statistically as a support player than an entry or any other role, but like 7-27 is just so bad. But I think a lot of people are just willing to write off this roster too quickly. I just think people that watch Siege, and probably people that just watch esports in general, are a bit too reactionary. They have one bad event, and it was their first event as this roster. So, give them some time. I think the potential is there. I think that Mowgli especially, and also Deadshot, have proven themselves to be really strong fraggers. And yeah, so we'll have to see how this team turns out. I don't think any judgments made thus far are necessarily indicative of much. And again, there is a lot of room in Europe as far as all of the slots to be occupied besides BDS. They would have to have a pretty big fall off to not be number one, but second place, third place, fourth place, those are all more or less up for grabs, even though it feels like there's sort of a pecking order in place at the moment. Then we have Fnatic, and some perplexing changes from these guys. They were Leon, Deepak, Jigsaw, Jegs, and Tyrant, and I thought this was a decent looking roster coming into stage number 1, and then they did not so well, admittedly. They had some showings where they looked decent, and then some where they really didn't, and they make a few changes. They dropped Tyrant and Jigsaw, who I feel like are pretty solid players. They certainly had their off days, but I think I would have preferred to see this team make no changes to just take another stab at it. But here we are, and they pick up Kanto and Sarks. And Sarks, I have no idea who this guy is. It showed no team history for him on Liquipedia outside of just random T3 pickup teams, T3, T4, whatever. I guess he must have been a really promising player if he went straight to T1. And then Kanto, who has bounced around Europe so much. He was on basically this team, not when they were Fnatic, but he was on Rogue/Koi. He was dropped, he went to ITB, he was dropped, he went to Wild, he was dropped, and now here he is back on a team with Deepak and Leon. Obviously, Kanto is past his prime. Is he past his days of being a valuable member of an EUL team? Maybe not, but I kind of feel like he's past his days of being on a top team. So I don't know, I don't love the direction this team has gone. I think they have some solid players. Like I think Deepak and maybe Jegs hasn't proved it as much, but I think they're both pretty solid players. And we'll have to see. Maybe Kanto will frag out again. He had a pretty good stage, one of his stages on ITB, and maybe Sarks is going to be the next Shaiko or something. We'll have to see. I'm just not sold on this team. They will certainly have to perform well for me to get on board with them. Then we have G2, and I think this is the last team. Yeah, they made their changes before Esports World Cup qualifiers. They were looking okay, and then they ended up losing to Wolves, I think. They got eliminated. And yeah, as for the actual changes, before they were Virtue, Alamau, Doki, Benjamaster, and Uno. That was 4/5 of the team that won SI in 2023. They had Blur, and now they have Uno. And then they made a few changes. Yeah, they dropped Virtue and Benjamaster. They pick up Loira and Blaz, and it just looks like a downgrade at face value. Like Virtue and Benjamaster, I mean, dropping world champions always seems like a downgrade, right? Especially for more or less unproven players. Loira is still a very new player, and Blaz has been around for a long time, but he's never seemingly had that big of an impact. He's played on teams that just very rarely qualify for anything or even do that well. He does have a lot of statistically good performances under his belt, but there's also a lot of people that point the stat padding finger at him, the baiter finger, all that sort of stuff. So it's make it or break it time, I think, for Blaz now that he's on a team. I guess technically G2 wasn't a top team last stage, but not too long ago, G2 was pretty clearly one of the better teams in the world. And then, yeah, Loira, really new player. We're going to have to see some stuff from him. There must be a good reason he gets picked up. And another Brazilian player. So G2 gets more and more Brazilian as time goes on. Now they have 2 Brazilians on the playing roster, as well as their coach being Brazilian. Virtue goes over to Team Secret, already talked about that. Benjamaster went over to SSG, already talked about that, not in this video, but in the North America one. So yeah, Alamau, Doki, Uno, Loira, and Blaz, they look like they have potential. Like I could certainly see these guys qualifying for a major, but I don't know, I'm gonna have to see some impressive stuff before I start saying they can make a top 8 or top 4 or a grand final or any of that at a major. And okay, I think that does it for this video. I think that's gonna do it for me. Let me know what you think about these changes, and I will catch you guys next time.